During a vacation in Switzerland, Chris Nielsen meets a wonderful young woman named Annie Collins, and they fall in love at first sight. A little time passes, and soon Chris is leading Annie dressed in a wedding gown down the aisle. Before long, the couple has 2 children, a son Ian, and a daughter Marie. They are the happiest family. Chris and Annie enjoy each other every day, as if it were their very first meeting. But sooner or later everything comes to an end. That day the children as usual went off to school, and it was the last time their parents saw them alive. A car accident had occurred. The funeral takes place. The priest delivers the eulogy, saying that all pure souls are awaited by eternal heaven after death. Yet for the grieving parents this is of no importance, for they must endure suffering here, in earthly life. 4 years pass. Chris, a pediatrician, is completely absorbed in his work. For him it is a way to cope with grief. Annie, an artist, works in a gallery. Since then, the couple has never dared to have another child. But despite the terrible tragedy that divided their life into before and after, their love has not faded. One evening after his shift, Chris witnesses a car crash in a tunnel and immediately rushes to help the injured, when suddenly one of the cars flung aside strikes him directly. Chris is taken to the hospital in critical condition. All this time he hears a voice, even when his heart finally stops. Yet Chris cannot comprehend his own death, even when he sees a strange man, his silhouette blurred, accompanying him everywhere, the very one to whom that voice belongs. Chris finds himself at his own funeral and sees Annie weeping. The being tells Chris that he has died, but the man keeps denying it, taking his companion for a doctor, and everything happening for a dream. Naturally Chris longs to see his son and daughter alive, and in his mind he relives certain moments of life which for one reason or another had seemed important. Even when Chris finds himself in the church and sees the coffin, where his body supposedly lies, he is not ready to accept the fact of his death. Yet apart from the blurred being, no one reacts to him. Everyone mourns his passing. Annie's gaze is completely empty. First she lost the children, then her beloved husband. Her life has no meaning anymore. Chris shows the being a painting Annie gave him on their wedding anniversary. It depicts a landscape with a cottage by a lake, where they had wished to spend their old age. So the funeral comes to an end. Chris remains on Earth in the form of a ghost. To keep from going completely insane, Annie keeps a diary, in which she writes that her husband had been everything to her. Even after losing the children, it was he, not the psychiatrist, who gave her the strength to go on living. Chris keeps repeating that he is here, beside her. Feeling his presence, Annie cannot hold back her tears of pain and crushes the diary page in her hand. To her, the worst thing that can happen to a human being has already happened. The being continues to follow Chris everywhere, explaining that his presence only makes Annie suffer more. She visits his grave every day. Chris is not ready to let her go and promises that he will always remain by her side. At that moment she begins to cry out in despair. This forces him at last to make the difficult decision, to release his beloved wife and forever leave the earthly life. Chris ascends to heaven, to his own paradise, resembling his wife's painting, the place where they had dreamed of growing old together. Chris also meets his deceased pet, the dog Katie. Everything around him is unreal, created by his imagination. Here his soul can find the eternal peace it deserves, for he did not sin in earthly life but performed good deeds, helping his young patients. Even the loss of his own children did not make him turn bitter toward the world. Suddenly Chris sees that the being who had accompanied him after death begins to take shape. It is his friend and former mentor at the hospital, Albert Lewis, who had passed away at the age of 63. In a sense Chris had intuited this from the start, since he had kept calling him doctor. Albert explains that here Chris is free to shape the world however he wishes. It is in a sense a projection of his ideal life, a place where there is no room for worry or care. The laws of physics or logic no longer apply here. Accompanied by Albert, Chris enters the cabin Annie once painted in her picture. It is no surprise that his subconscious chose this very place as his personal heaven. Chris is only beginning to adapt to this new world. Albert teaches him to believe that everything around them is not merely canvas and paint but real. Everything will be exactly as they desire. Chris asks Albert where God is. Albert answers that he is somewhere out there, even higher. Meanwhile Annie, immersed in depression, paints a bleak landscape. She believes her beloved can hear her and feel everything she feels. In heaven there is no gravity, no limitations of any kind, so Chris can even fly. But he enjoys this absolute freedom only briefly, for he suddenly sees a tree appear against the darkened sky, the very one from Annie's new painting. Chris immediately realizes that it was painted by his wife. Albert is astonished, because such a bond of souls is an extremely rare phenomenon. They are together forever, even after death, and they can communicate through painting. Annie's despair knows no bounds. Feeling her endless grief, Chris weeps and cries out that he loves her. Yet it only wounds Annie even more. Why should she go on living, when she has lost everyone dear to her? In his new world Chris sees Annie everywhere. Albert tells him that it is only an illusion. and that it would be better to try to banish memories of earthly life from his mind. Time will heal everything. But Chris knows this is impossible. Seeing Marie's favorite toy, he asks Albert how he might see his children. Albert evasively replies that here there is room enough for everyone's own world, but that is not why the children are absent. However, if Chris longs for it strongly enough, then he will see them, sooner or later. He recalls how he once cared for his daughter when she was ill. Back then, he could never have imagined that everything might end so swiftly, so unjustly. Now Chris is trapped in this world of illusions. This time instead of Albert, an attractive woman named Leona appears. In earthly life she had been a flight attendant, and she leads him to a wondrous afterlife city, where souls coexist together so as not to be so lonely. Here one can even work. Albert, for example, rescues lost souls, those who are in hell. And Leona takes care of animals. According to her, hell is not as terrible as people say. For Annie to live even a single day is an immense ordeal. She has lost everyone in a car crash and melancholically jokes in her thoughts that perhaps it is time to buy a bicycle. Leona explains to Chris that sometimes souls return to Earth and are reborn, reincarnated. She asks Chris to talk about his daughter, to lighten the burden on his soul. He recalls how Marie once asked him what awaits us after death. Will it be heaven? At the time Chris answered that most likely heaven was nothing more than a beautiful fairy tale. Leona reveals that in her earthly life she had been different. Once flying on a plane with her father, she saw a beautiful Asian flight attendant with a badge reading Leona. The girl liked her so much that after death she wished to look the same. At that moment Chris realizes that before him stands his daughter, Marie. In tears they embrace. Annie understands that she no longer has any reason to live on this earth. She had love, she had children, and now all of it is gone. So Annie writes a farewell note, though she has no one left to bid farewell to. Chris thanks Albert for finding Marie for him. But joy turns into dread when Chris notices tears on Albert's face. With regret he says that Annie has died, she has voluntarily left her life. And this means that she and Chris will never meet, for those like Annie end up in hell. Chris erupts in fury, unable to understand for what sins his wife must be condemned to spend eternity in hell. She was not guilty of being unable to live without her soulmate on earth. Albert explains that here there are no judges and no defendants. Each person has their own hell. It does not have to be fire and brimstone. Those like Annie create for themselves terrifying afterworlds, born from their own pain. Chris is determined to rescue his wife from hell, though Albert insists it is impossible. No one has ever succeeded. However, seeing Chris's determination, Albert agrees to help and finds a guide for them. He warns that even if they manage to find Annie, she is unlikely to recognize him. It is stronger even than love. Chris will only be able to say farewell to her, and perhaps in that case his soul may finally find peace. They set out across the dark waters on a ship with red sails. Chris notes that in earthly life Albert had never been so compassionate and empathetic. A storm begins. The guide, who in earthly life had also been a doctor, says that the storm is not the true danger is losing one's mind. At that moment suffering souls rise from the dark waters, surround the ship and overturn it. Chris recalls how his wife reproached him for demanding too much from their son. Indeed, Chris often pressured Ian, insisting that he study harder and live up to his parents' expectations. The boy had felt sad, because his father did not understand that they were different. The three are cast ashore together with the wreckage of the ship. Chris sees ruins everywhere. The guide explains that these are the gates of hell. They head straight toward them. At that moment Chris realizes that before him stands his son in the form of Albert. He remembers how he gave the funeral speech for Ian and Marie. Chris had felt such sorrow, knowing that he had not always supported, nor always understood his son. But time cannot be turned back. There are things that cannot be changed. Chris does not allow Ian to enter the flames of hell. They embrace, having found each other once again. But the guide decides that Ian will not go any further with them, because thoughts of his son weaken Chris's mental connection with Annie. Before saying goodbye, Ian tells his father not to listen to anyone. When he finds Annie, he must take her soul out of hell, even if the others say it is impossible. That is why Ian chose to appear in the form of Albert. He was the only one Chris had ever listened to. But now he must listen to his son, and keep in mind the words he spoke after Ian and Marie were gone. Those very words saved Annie then, and they will save her again. Chris and the guide continue their journey, seeing suffering souls all around. The man remembers how after the tragedy, Annie had wanted a divorce. She could not understand how he had found the strength to go on living. At that time Chris had said that he loved the children just as much as she did, but they were gone. He decided to be strong because now the choice was only theirs: surrender, or go on living. And Chris chose to go on living. Chris and the guide ascend by a special lift to the required level of hell. From there, Chris must continue the journey alone. Beneath his feet the doomed souls moan, and in one of them he recognizes his father. Yet the man quickly realizes that in truth it is not his father. It is a sea of faces, within which Annie's soul is lost. When Chris sees his wife, he rushes toward her, only to fall through the floor and plummet for a long time, never ceasing to think of Annie. The guide appears again. Chris understands that he has found himself in a grotesque version of the home he once shared with Annie. The guide reminds him that it is an illusion. Those like Annie suffer deeply after death and create nightmares around themselves. All Chris desires is to reunite with his wife as quickly as possible, which makes him act recklessly and without thought. Therefore the guide reveals that he is in fact Albert Lewis. Even in earthly life he had been like a father to Chris and had always sought to protect him. And so now Albert warns Chris, urging him to think once more before seeking Annie in hell. If her reality becomes his, he too will inevitably lose his mind. But Chris still does not turn back and finds Annie, who appears disoriented and does not remember the fact of her death. She does not even remember Chris. He helps to drive away spiders she so fears and tries to awaken memories within her, but in vain. Chris recalls how after a month of his wife's silence, he had at last agreed to a divorce. He truly had not known how to help her. Each of them had borne that grief in their own way. It was at that moment Annie realized she was not ready to let him go. Now Chris understands that his determination to be strong and never surrender had been nothing more than a defense mechanism. It had been easier for him to detach from everything and simply forbid himself to think of the children. But Annie was different. He tries to revive in her the memory of their wedding, but even that does not help. Chris realizes that time is running out. He says that he would so wish to remain with her forever in the house by the lake, in their own private heaven. Chris thanks Annie for her kindness, for their children, for their first meeting, for being the one with whom he had wanted to spend his entire life. She was his life. Albert had known it would be so. Chris cannot save Annie, they are here only for him. The man decides not to return to heaven but to remain with Annie in hell forever, even if they both lose their minds and never recognize each other again. Chris asks Albert to tell the children how deeply he loves their mother and that he will never abandon her. His love for Annie is so great that he is willing to trade heaven for hell, so long as he may remain by her side. When she hears this, her soul is healed, and her memories return. Chris on the contrary begins to lose himself. Annie's nightmare has become his. Annie begs her beloved not to give in. She ascends to heaven, taking him with her. Thus the lovers are reunited. Their love has triumphed over all. Their embrace is interrupted by Albert, who asks whether they are ready for the promised surprise. At that moment their pet and their children appear, restored to their former selves. What more could one ask for to be happy? Soon Chris suggests to Annie that they return, to be reborn on earth, to meet each other, and to fall in love all over again. Their souls are bound and so their meeting is inevitable. The children have no objection, for human life here is but shorter than an instant. With a smile Annie asks how they will find each other. Chris replies that he found her in hell, and in New Jersey all the more so. In the final scene we see Chris and Annie still children meeting, under circumstances much like those of their past life.